Before we talk about China, can we just talk about this unfortunate, tragic tsunami in Japan? After all, Japan is the third largest economy in the world, and many Asian countries trade with Japan and trade with Africa. How will we be affected by events?
I think firstly our thoughts go out to those that are suffering. It obviously is a massive blow, not just economically, but of course on a humanitarian level. From the economic side, we just need to assess what the true extent of the damage is, and that news will only come in the next kind of days and weeks. Of course, over the course of this evening, we're going to see some more regions affected by that tsunami, some potentially less prepared than Japan. In terms of the effect on Africa, Japan, sure, as we wrote in a recent report, is a very important strategic partner for Africa, not only in the commercial sense, but also as a development partner. And I think given the tremendous burden of reconstruction and redevelopment that they're going to be placed under, potentially those flows will be diminished.
I mean, obviously the tsunami and the situation in Japan may have a bearing on China, which is now effectively Africa's largest trading partner. What are the challenges that China faces in general in today's world? Because tsunami today, recently it's been issues around inflation. It's also been issues about the economy overheating.
Well, I think we've just seen China announce its new 5-year plan. And one of the big shifts, well, potentially not shifts, but one of the big messages there was that China is going to be looking far more domestically for domestic-led growth. And inflation has been announced and admitted by the government as a tremendous concern, given the impact that it has on the poor. And we know that the social weight or at least responsibilities of the Chinese government are particularly large. So I think going forward for the next 5 years, we will see a restructuring of the Chinese economy that will create more internal domestic demand. Right. And I think for Africa, that does mean that demand for resources, natural resources, is going to remain robust. So if we look at the next 5 years, there will be a cooling off of Chinese growth. We won't be seeing the same peaks as we've seen in the last few years. But the structural nature of its ties with Africa are still very strong.
I mean, when we talk about a revision of the Chinese growth model, some are saying we need to see less of the Chinese state involved and more private sector engagement, as you're suggesting, more SME focus. Would that in any way change the investment profile or the investment strategy of the Chinese in Africa?
I think often people underestimate the level of private investment from China in Africa as it stands. Sure, the big kind of flag-bearing investments are those state-owned state-owned SOEs coming into Africa, blazing a trail in the resources, financial services, telecommunication sectors. But we need to look beyond that and look at a tremendous thrust of small-scale Chinese private investment across the continent, which even the Chinese government has admitted that it has very little awareness of, sometimes no control over. So the manner in which these companies engage is often contradictory to the state push on the continent. And that really explains the fact that there's this dual drive in Africa. So sure, we are going to see a kind of a stimulus of internal demand in China, which will create some smaller, very robust and competitive firms, and those might take on opportunities in Africa. But already we're seeing a tremendous drive of those Chinese entrepreneurs on the continent. If you look at Libya, for example, look at how many tens of thousands of Chinese nationals were evacuated from Libya, really proving the extent of the infiltration of Chinese entrepreneurs in the course of the past decade.
We often talk about the Chinese and we talk about the competition that the Americans and the Europeans have to contend with. Do the Americans see it as competition? Do they feel that now's the time to reorientate their Africa strategy? I
think to a certain extent, yes. If you look at at American aid, for example, to Africa, America sat largely at the periphery of aid to Africa for the 80s and 90s, but since 2000, 2001, they've become by far Africa's largest overseas development assistance, ODA partner, as measured by the OECD. That coincided largely with the presidency of the former President George Bush, largely around strategic concerns post 9/11, but particularly around energy security, given certain tensions in the Middle East. And if we look at what's going on in the Middle East at the moment, those tensions are certainly continuing, if not being elevated. That will increase the relevance of Africa. So that coincided with China's push into the continent. Right. So it's very difficult to differentiate. Is the US concentrating on Africa because of its own internal demands, which is very clear and obvious? And then China comes in as an opposing force, which it feels it needs to adopt some new strategies, some more flexible and nimble strategies in order to compete with.
Let's talk about those strategies as everybody makes a push for Africa. The Chinese have now become famous for the concessions and loans, soft loans for resources model, which raises its own sort of issues around distortion. But can they continue on that tack, or does it mean that the other players have to also start being a little more creative and stop issuing these conditionalities when they deal with Africa?
Sure, I think it's a relevant point. And if you look at infrastructure financing, for example, China's come in with a very pragmatic model. The speed and the scale of its ability to finance and implement infrastructure projects in Africa has really woken up a lot of Africa's multilateral and foreign donor partners. So if you look at the World Bank is now looking to partner with China on infrastructure in Africa. And I think these coordination strategies will become more prevalent with China, even with the US. So it's not necessarily a binary decision that we're looking here. It really is a matter of what is the most effective and whether partnership would work for that. But certainly this loans or concessional loans in exchange for resource, infrastructure for resource deals, I think they've still got some legroom to expand in Africa, given our infrastructure deficit and given the amount of financing that we need to really unlock the very nascent growth we're seeing in our consumer markets.
And very briefly and finally, Africa's response to China. Some countries like Zimbabwe, for instance, have just opted for a look east policy. The Angolans similarly. Is that a simplistic approach to it?
Absolutely. We're quite concerned about this somewhat immature, simplistic foreign policy shift from west to east, from north to south, this south-south thrust. I think increasingly and very soon we're going to see far more layers within this emerging market paradigm. It's going to no longer be relevant to talk of China in the same bracket that you talk of Sierra Leone or Chad. And I think these layers will create more diversity in the discussion around north, south, east, west, these big polar opposites, which I feel are somewhat destructive when it comes to the orientation of foreign policy. African governments, and South Africa is taking a lead in this, need to realize that the rise of the BRICS, the rise of China, creates a multipolar environment rather than new poles of power which you need to favor rather than the poles that you used to be in partnership with. So it's a multipolar environment. We need to remain cognizant of that. And within that realm, the United States, as you mentioned, by far the world's largest economy, will reorient its strategies, is going to continue to be a very vital partner for Africa.